My husband travels for work about 2 weeks every month, which means I spend a significant portion of my life alone in our house in a suburb of Memphis, Tennessee. I want to be clear that I am not someone who finds this arrangement difficult under normal circumstances. I have been doing it for 4 years since he took the regional sales position, and I have my routine, my friends, and my work from home schedule, and the specific comfortable independence that comes from being genuinely okay with your own company. My husband had been gone for 3 days of a 2-week trip in late September when I first noticed it. I want to describe the first thing carefully because it sounds small, but the smallness of it is exactly what allowed me to dismiss it initially and what makes it more significant in retrospect. I was in the kitchen making dinner, around 7 in the evening, and I went to the cabinet where I kept the cooking oils, and I noticed that the olive oil bottle was on the wrong shelf. Not on the wrong side of the shelf, not slightly out of position. On a completely different shelf from where it had always lived, where I had reached for it approximately 400 times in the 2 years since we had lived in this house. It was one shelf lower than where it should have been. I put it back. I told myself I had moved it without remembering, which was the available explanation and which I fully accepted. I made dinner and ate it and watched something on television and went to bed. 2 nights later, which was the 5th night of my husband's trip, I was getting ready for bed and I went into the bathroom to wash my face, and I noticed that the hand towel on the ring beside the sink was hanging differently than I hang it. I always fold it in thirds and hang it so that the folded edge faces out. The towel was hanging with the open edge facing out. Not dramatically wrong. Not thrown on the floor or missing. Just hung differently from how I hang it by someone who did not know how I hung it. I stood in the bathroom at 10:45 at night and I looked at the towel and I thought about the olive oil. 2 things, both small, both in the category of things that could be attributed to my own inattention, but both in the specific category of things that I did not do incorrectly after years of doing them the same way every time. I rehung the towel the way I hung it, and I went to bed, and I did not sleep well. The following morning, I went through the house systematically in the way that I had not done the previous evening, because doing it the previous evening would have required me to commit to a conclusion I was not ready to commit to. I was ready in the morning. I went room by room, and I looked at everything I could assess for position or arrangement, and I found 3 more things. The back door's deadbolt was in the unlocked position. I always locked it before bed, and I had locked it the previous night. I was certain of that because locking the back door was the last thing I did before my bedtime routine, a habit so established that I could have done it in my sleep. The deadbolt was unlocked. The blanket on the guest room bed, which I had laundered and folded at the foot of the bed when my mother-in-law had visited the previous month, was unfolded. Not on the floor, not displaced. Unfolded and laid partially open, as though someone had put it over themselves and then put it back in an approximate recreation of its folded state. The 3rd thing was in my home office, where I worked during the day. My desk chair was not in the position I left it. I always pushed it in squarely to the desk when I finished working. The chair was pulled out and angled slightly, in the position of a chair that someone has gotten up from rather than a chair that has been pushed in. I sat down on the couch in the living room and I processed these 5 things together. The olive oil, the towel, the unlocked deadbolt, the unfolded blanket, the desk chair. 5 things across 5 days, each of them individually attributable to my own inattention, collectively producing a pattern that my inattention could not account for because I did not make all 5 of those particular errors in the same week, and my life did not work in ways that would produce them coincidentally. Someone had been in my house, not once. Multiple times, across multiple nights, doing things in the specific quiet way of someone who understood that they needed to leave the house looking the way they had found it and who was not entirely succeeding. I called my husband first. He answered on the first ring and I told him everything in order, and he was quiet in a way that told me he was taking it as seriously as I was. He said he was coming home, that he would rebook his flights and be home that night. I told him to wait until I had called the police because I did not want to make a decision based on something I had not yet officially reported, and he said okay and said he would be ready to come the moment I told him to. I called the non-emergency police line and described what I had found. The dispatcher sent 2 officers who arrived within 20 minutes. They were professional and thorough, and they did the specific thing that I needed them to do, which was to take the accumulated pattern seriously rather than treating each individual item as too small to warrant concern. They walked through the house with me, and I showed them each of the 5 things, and the senior officer, a woman in her 40s, said that the pattern I was describing was consistent with what her department called a pattern of entry, where someone accesses a residence multiple times over a period of days, and that the most significant element was the unlocked deadbolt because it suggested the person had a means of entry that did not require forcing the lock. She asked whether all the windows were locked and whether there was any entry point other than the front and back doors. I had not checked the windows, and we checked them together. The first floor bathroom window, the one at the back of the house on the side near the fence, was unlocked. Not open. Unlocked. The latch was in the open position. The window was the kind that slid horizontally, and that, unlocked, could be pushed open from the outside with sufficient pressure against the frame. The officer photographed the window and called for a forensics unit to come and check the frame and sill. The forensics unit found something on the exterior window sill that the officer described to me in careful professional language as a surface transfer consistent with repeated contact from an exterior surface. The specific language for what they found, in plain terms, was that the paint on the exterior windowsill showed wear marks in a pattern consistent with someone using that window to enter the house multiple times. I called my husband and told him to come home. He was on a flight within 3 hours. I did not stay in the house that night. I called my friend Deborah, who lived 12 minutes away, and I drove to her house, and I sat in her kitchen and I drank tea, and I did not sleep until my husband texted me from the driveway at 2 in the morning, and I drove home to meet him. The police investigation identified a point of interest. The fence on the side of the house adjacent to the bathroom window, which divided our yard from the rear easement behind the property, had 2 fence boards that were loose at their base. Not broken, not recently damaged. Loose in the way of boards that had been pushed inward from the easement side repeatedly enough that the screws at their base had worked free from the wood. The easement ran behind a row of 4 houses on our street and connected to a service alley at both ends. Someone had been accessing our yard from the easement through those fence boards and accessing our house through the bathroom window on a schedule that I could not identify because I had been asleep during each entry. The police filed a report and canvassed the neighbors and extended their investigation to the service alley and the surrounding area. I do not know the outcome of that investigation beyond what they told me in the 2 follow-up calls I received from the case detective over the following month. No arrest was made that I was informed of. The fence boards were repaired and a new lock was installed on the bathroom window, and a security system was put in the house within 4 days of my husband's return. I still live in that house. My husband travels less now, which was his decision and which we have not discussed at length because we do not need to. The security system covers every entry point and the motion sensors cover the yard, and the app on my phone shows me every camera feed in real time. I have not found anything out of place in the house since the security system was installed. But I check the olive oil bottle every evening before I make dinner, which is not something I ever did before September 2 years ago, and which is not something I plan to stop doing. My wife was visiting her mother in Portland for 10 days, and I was alone in our house in a suburb of Denver, Colorado. I had been alone in the house before, during her travel, many times, and it had never produced anything worth describing. I worked from home, I had my routine, I had the specific, comfortable independence of a middle-aged man who was used to his own company. I am saying this clearly because I need you to understand that what I experienced was not anxiety about being alone. It was information, delivered gradually, that something specific was wrong. It started on the 3rd night of my wife's trip. I was in the living room at around 9 watching something on television, and the dog, a 7-year-old Labrador mix named Wallace, who had been with us since he was a puppy and who had never in his life done anything more dramatic than bark at the mail carrier, got up from his position on the rug beside the couch and walked to the back sliding door and stood there. Not the alert posture I had seen from him when deer came to the back fence, not the excited posture he produced when he thought he was going for a walk. Something I had not seen from Wallace before, a low sustained alertness with his weight slightly forward and his attention absolutely fixed on the backyard beyond the glass. I went and looked over the glass with him. The backyard was dark, our motion-activated floodlight showing only the deck and the grass immediately beyond it, the wooden fence at the back of the property barely visible at the edge of the light's reach. I could not see anything. Wallace stayed at the door for approximately 8 minutes and then walked back to his rug and lay down, which I took as the all-clear signal and which was probably the most expensive piece of reasoning I have ever done in terms of what it cost me in sleep over the following days. The second thing happened the following night. I had been more attentive about the backyard that evening and had checked it through the sliding door several times before going to bed at around 10:30. Nothing. I fell asleep without difficulty, and at approximately 1 in the morning I woke up, not from any sound that I could identify after the fact, but with the full alertness that something specific produces. I lay still and listened. The house was quiet. Wallace was quiet. I listened for several minutes and heard nothing, and I was about to attribute it to the specific vulnerability of light sleep when I heard something from the side of the house. The side of our house between our property and our neighbor's property to the east had a narrow passage about 4 feet wide that ran from the front sidewalk to the backyard gate. We used it occasionally to move equipment from the front to the back, but it had no practical function for anyone who did not have a reason to access our backyard. What I heard from that passage at 1 in the morning was movement. Not one sound, not ambiguous, not the sound of a branch or an animal. The specific sequential sound of a person moving through that passage at a careful pace, the specific quality of someone who was trying to make as little noise as possible and was not entirely succeeding. I sat up in bed. Wallace, who was on his dog bed in the corner of the bedroom, lifted his head. He did not bark. He listened the same way I was listening, with the specific focused attention that I recognized from the sliding door the previous night. The sound in the side passage continued for approximately 10 seconds and then stopped. I did not go to the window. I sat in the bed and I thought about what I was going to do. My phone was on the nightstand. My wife was in Portland. Whatever was in the side passage of my house at 1 in the morning was either a neighbor with an inexplicable reason to be in that specific space at that hour, which was the most generous interpretation available, or it was something else. I called 911. I want to be direct about that decision because I know there is a version of this story where the narrator debates the call and talks himself out of making it and waits to see what happens next. I did not do that. I had heard specific sequential movement in a narrow passage on the side of my house at 1 in the morning and I was alone, and I made the call immediately. The dispatcher kept me on the line while 2 officers were routed to my address. They arrived in approximately 7 minutes, which I know precisely because I watched the clock from the moment I made the call. I met them at the front door with Wallace beside me, and I described what I had heard and where I had heard it. They went around the side of the house with their flashlights while I waited at the front door. They came back to the front a few minutes later, and one of them told me to come look at something, which is the kind of sentence that produces a specific feeling when you hear it from a police officer at 1 in the morning. I went around the side of the house with them. In the narrow passage between my house and the neighbor's fence, at approximately the midpoint of the passage between the front sidewalk and the backyard gate, one of the officers directed his flashlight at the fence on the neighbor's side. There were 2 fence boards that were displaced, pushed inward toward the passage from the neighbor's side, creating a gap that someone could pass through from the neighbor's backyard into my side passage. The boards were not broken. They had been pushed deliberately and had been pushed before, the wood around the displacement showing the marks of repeated contact in the same position. There was something else in the passage. On the ground in the passage, against my house's foundation wall, there was a small area where the dirt at the foundation base had been disturbed. Not recently, or not only recently. The disturbance had the character of something that had been there for a period of time and had been added to. The officer crouched and looked at it and then looked at me and asked if I had done any work at the foundation in that area. I had not. The second officer had gone around to the backyard through the back gate, and he came back around and told his partner that the backyard showed no sign of entry, that the back gate was secured, and that whoever had been in the side passage had either left through the displaced fence boards back into the neighbor's yard or had gone back to the front sidewalk. The neighbor's house was dark. It was 1 a.m, and the neighbor, an older man who I knew by face and occasional wave, was clearly asleep. The officers filed a report and told me to contact them if anything further occurred. One of them made a specific point of telling me to repair or reinforce the displaced fence boards as soon as possible, which was advice I implemented at 7 the following morning using screws rather than nails and brackets that I bought from the hardware store before it was technically open for business by waiting at the door. I called my wife that morning and told her everything. She was on a flight home within 4 hours, cutting the trip short, and I did not argue with her about it. The Denver Police Department followed up with me once, 10 days later, with a call from the assigned detective who told me that the neighbor's property had been checked and the neighbor had no knowledge of the displaced fence boards, that the boards had likely been displaced by someone using the neighbor's property as a staging point rather than by the neighbor himself, and that there was no evidence sufficient to identify a specific individual. He told me to make sure my exterior lighting was comprehensive and that my side passage was not accessible without significant effort, and that I should call immediately if anything further occurred. Nothing further occurred. My wife came home, and we had the fence on both sides of the passage, reinforced professionally, and we had additional exterior lighting installed, covering every angle of the property. Wallace has not stood at the sliding door since then, in the way he stood at it on that first night. But I check the side passage every night before bed now, which requires me to go out the front door and look down the length of it from the sidewalk, and then go through the back gate and look at the back end of it, and confirm that nothing is in it. My wife knows I do this, and she has never asked me to stop. The check takes about 90 seconds, and I do it in all weather and at all hours, depending on when I go to bed. It is the specific habit that the third night of a trip to Portland left behind, and I am not under any illusion that it will stop being a habit. I rented a second-floor apartment in a converted Victorian house in Savannah, Georgia. The building had 3 units, mine on the second floor, another tenant on the third floor whom I rarely saw, and a ground floor unit that had been vacant for the 3 months since I had moved in. The building was managed by a property company rather than an on-site landlord, and the management was responsive to maintenance issues, but not particularly engaged with the building's day-to-day life. The week in question was in February, when my upstairs neighbor, the only other occupant of the building, left for a 2-week trip to visit family. She told me she was going on a Friday afternoon as she was loading her car, and I waved goodbye from my window and genuinely did not think anything further about her absence until Sunday night when I was in my kitchen making dinner and I heard footsteps from the floor above me. Not 1 or 2 ambiguous sounds. Sustained footsteps. A person-paced sequence of steps moving across what I knew was my neighbor's living room floor because I had been up there once when she had invited me for dinner, moving from the direction of her front door toward the direction of her kitchen. Deliberate, unhurried, the specific pattern of someone moving through a familiar space. I stood in my kitchen with the stove on and I listened. The footsteps continued for approximately 30 seconds and then stopped. I waited. A minute of silence. 2 minutes. I turned the stove down and I thought about the most reasonable explanation. My neighbor had come back early. That was the most available explanation, and it was a good one. She had come back early for any number of reasons and had not told me because she had no obligation to tell me. I turned the stove back up and made my dinner. I did not hear the footsteps again that night. The following day I went about my normal work from home routine and thought nothing of it. It was on Monday evening at approximately 9 o'clock that I heard them again. The same pattern, the same floor, the same direction of movement across my neighbor's living room toward her kitchen. I stood in my living room directly below the sound and I listened, and they continued for approximately 40 seconds and then stopped again. I went upstairs. I knocked on my neighbor's door. No answer. I knocked again and waited, and there was no answer, and the apartment was silent beyond the door. I went back downstairs and I texted my neighbor. She replied within 10 minutes from what she described as her parents' house in Ohio, saying she had not come back early and would not be back for another 11 days. I called the property management company. It was after hours, and I left a message describing footsteps in the vacant upper unit on 2 separate evenings and asking whether anyone had authorized access to that apartment. The property management company did not call me back until the following morning, at which point they told me that no authorized access had been scheduled and that no maintenance or inspection had been arranged for that unit. I want to describe Tuesday evening carefully because it is the most significant part of this account. I had spent Monday night and all of Tuesday with a specific heightened awareness of the sounds from the floor above me, and Tuesday had been quiet. Nothing from upstairs during the day, nothing during the early evening. By 9:30, I had begun to relax the specific alertness I had been maintaining, and I was in my bedroom reading when I heard something that was different from the footsteps. It was not movement. It was a voice. Low, male, from somewhere above me, from a position that, when I mapped it against my knowledge of the upstairs floor plan, corresponded to my neighbor's bedroom directly above mine. Not words I could make out. The specific low register of someone speaking quietly, the tone and rhythm of a voice rather than the content, for approximately 15 seconds and then silence. I got up from my bed and I stood in my bedroom and I looked at the ceiling, and I had the specific cold feeling of understanding something before I could articulate what I understood. Someone was in the apartment above mine. Had been in it twice that I had heard before this. Was in it now. And their position in the apartment, directly above my bedroom, at 9:30 on a Tuesday night, was not the position of someone who had a legitimate and innocent reason to be in that space. I took my phone and my keys in my bag and I walked out my front door and I went downstairs to the street and I called 911 from the sidewalk in front of the building. 2 officers arrived within 6 minutes. I described what I had heard on Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday evenings. The footsteps, the voice, the specific upstairs apartment whose sole tenant was confirmed out of state. The officers went into the building and upstairs with the property management company's emergency line authorization to use a master key. They found the upstairs apartment unlocked. Not broken into. Unlocked. The front door had not been forced and showed no signs of the lock being bypassed. Someone had access to that apartment through means that did not require forcing the lock. They found the apartment empty of any person when they searched it, but they found 3 things that they documented and that the property management company was required to respond to. A sleeping bag in the closet of the bedroom, folded but recently used. Food wrappers in the kitchen cabinet, the kind that accumulate from days rather than from a single visit. And on the fire escape accessible from the 3rd floor unit's bedroom window, which connected via the building's external fire escape ladder to the ground floor and to the exterior, a piece of fabric caught on the ladder's rail at approximately the 2nd floor level, consistent with someone who had descended the fire escape in a hurry. The property management company's investigation, conducted over the following 2 weeks, with the results shared with me in a phone call from the district property manager, determined that the ground floor vacant unit had been accessed at some point during the 3 months it had been empty, that its lock had been compromised in a way that the investigation could not fully account for, and that the fire escape provided access between the vacant ground floor unit's back window, the fire escape ladder, and the occupied upper floors. The person who had been in the building had been using the ground floor vacant unit as a base and the fire escape as an internal navigation system between the floors. The property manager told me this and offered me lease termination without penalty, which I accepted within 24 hours. I was out of the building within 3 weeks.